From the Netherlands, this is the Green Planet Monitor, voices and stories from a warm, wet planet. Today, war is not healthy for children and other living things. It isn't healthy for planet Earth's climate system either.
One single F-35 tank of gas produces the equivalent of 28 metric tons of carbon dioxide. So huge polluters, and this is just looking at one particular weapons system.
The cradle of crop diversity here on planet Earth? Ethiopia.
There is one type of sorghum here in Ethiopia known as Wotatbogunche, which means milk in my cheeks, if you translate it literally.
Milk in my cheeks.
Which shows farmers know the value, although they don't say it. It is high lysine stuff. That thing is found, to my best knowledge, only in Ethiopia.
And Israel-Palestine, a discrete toponym, 6 syllables tripping off the tongue.
Israel and Palestine, to me, implies that they're two different geographical locations. When I arrive at Ben Gurion Airport, the sign says, "Welcome to Israel," but my Palestinian friends meet me at the airport and they say, "Welcome to Palestine." So I always say Israel-Palestine.
This is the Green Planet Monitor. I'm David Kattenberg. Before launching in, a request. Help us deliver this weekly package of Earth news. Subscribe and or donate at greenplanetmonitor.net. Back in the 1960s, at the height of the Vietnam War, American artist Lorraine Schneider created a poster for a group called Another Mother for Peace. Intertwined in the leaves and petals of a black sunflower, splashed in black against an electric yellow background, these famous words: "War is not healthy for children and other living things." War, as it happens, isn't healthy for Earth's climate system either. The connections between permanent war and climate breakdown aren't something that gets discussed at global climate conferences or in the media. It is a subject of interest for the U.S. anti-war group Code Pink. I talked about their climate crisis and militarism campaign with Code Pink co-founder Medea Benjamin. Why do you think that militarism doesn't get very much attention when people are looking at and analyzing and trying to tackle the global climate crisis?
I don't know, David. It's such a good question. I think in some ways, the American people have a hard time dealing with foreign policy issues, particularly issues around war and peace. There's so much propaganda in the US media, and there's so much of a rah-rah military sentiment. A lot of that can be traced to the billions of dollars of US tax money that actually go to the Pentagon for advertising the Pentagon. So you see ads for the military that are in major sports events. You see it in religious arenas. You see it in the billboards in the Washington, D.C., where I live, in the metros, in the bus stations. There's constantly this elevation of not only the military itself, but also the weapons contractors and how they are keeping us safe, how they are part of the fight for democracy around the world. And I think, unfortunately, this intense propaganda campaign has had a lot of influence, because even when the military has been constantly losing wars since Vietnam, unless you count Grenada, which had a population of about 100,000, but in recent times, losing a war against the Taliban in Afghanistan, losing and making a horrific mess in Iraq, creating havoc in Libya, you still see the U.S. military as being one of the most trusted, if not the most trusted agency in the United States. There's also the fact that the U.S. military has a huge lobbying campaign in Congress. There's a lot of money that gets thrown around. There are more lobbyists for the weapons contractors than there are members of Congress. So all of these are some of the reasons that it gets obscured among the American public. And even among activists, we have a very hard time getting environmental organizations to speak out against militarism and war. We've been at it for years now, David, trying to do this, and find that it is very difficult. I think in some ways they think we've got enough on our plates with what we have right now. Starting to poke at the military-industrial complex will only be much more difficult for us.
Now, let's go through these 10 ways that the climate crisis and militarism are intertwined. And number one here is an obvious one. The U.S. military has traditionally protected big oil and other extractive industries. And indeed, we've got hundreds of U.S. military bases spread around the world in resource-rich, oil-rich regions. And there have been all these wars that have been fought for oil. So what's the connection between American war fighting and war preparation and power projection and this imperative to ensure that America has a constant supply of this most crucial material that drives the American economy for sure, oil?
Well, yes, we've seen over the decades how this imperative to make sure that the U.S. not only has enough oil itself, but the U.S. controls where the oil is going elsewhere. And for example, the strong connections that the U.S. has had to Saudi Arabia, when today the U.S. does not need oil from Saudi Arabia, but wants to help determine where that oil is going. And so it has been part of this U.S. striving for hegemony to be on top of where these massive reserves of oil and gas are coming from, who has access to them, and make sure that our military is controlling that. Now, it's not possible for the U.S. to keep doing that now that China is such an important economic power, now that the Saudis don't really jump to the tune of the United States. The U.S. doesn't have as much ability to control that, but you can see on a map of U.S. bases around the world that many of those bases are indeed around countries that have large supplies of oil. Let's look at what happened in the 1950s when Iran had a government, a democratically elected government that wanted to nationalize the oil. That was when the U.S. came in and overthrew that government. So we have seen historically how the U.S. has tried to stop countries from nationalizing the oil to make sure that U.S. companies can get in there and control that oil. We even see today where the U.S. has been in the Middle East, including in places like Syria, where it maintains still about 900 U.S. troops and continues to steal oil that belongs to the Syrian people. So there is a tremendous connection. And if you look at Ukraine, we have to ask who blew up the pipeline that was taking the natural gas from Russia into Western Europe. The U.S. Representatives in states like Texas and Louisiana have for years been complaining about that pipeline and saying that the U.S. government shouldn't allow Germany to have that kind of a trade relationship with Russia. Lo and behold, the pipeline is blown up, and who jumps in to replace the sanctioned Russian energy? It's U.S. companies. So there, once again, we see a connection between the U.S. fueling a war in Ukraine and stopping peace negotiations from happening, while U.S. companies are benefiting with record profits that they have never, ever seen before, David, in 2022 from the price gouging that they're doing, selling natural gas and oil to Europe.
Now, meanwhile, the Pentagon, you write, Code Pink writes, is the single largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world. And if the Pentagon were a country, its fuel use alone would make it the 47th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world.
And yet, in international agreements, the emissions from the Pentagon are excluded military emissions have been excluded, and they've been made voluntary instead of mandatory.
They've been excluded from what?
From reporting on countries' global carbon footprint. And so now it's just a voluntary thing that countries can do to include the footprint of their militaries.
So the Pentagon is the single largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world. Can you provide further information about this?
I think you just gave the specifics of that, but we can look at that in terms of having about 800 military bases around the world, and what is the carbon footprint of those military bases. You can look at the machinery of war and how carbon intense it is to produce them as well as to use them. The Abrams tank, for example, getting 3 or 4 miles a gallon.
And how do these top war machine producing American companies, that they are the top 3 companies in the world, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, that produce equipment that consume fossil fuels. Can you talk a bit about this? Like, I'm wondering how much fuel, an F-35 fighter jet or any of these high-performance jet fighters consume and what their emissions are. People talk about passenger planes and how they're such a huge problem emitting greenhouse gases. How about these high-performance jet fighters that our friends at Lockheed Martin and Boeing and produce Northrop Grumman?
Yes, massive amounts of fuel. We have a campaign that looks at the F-35 and talks about how it uses the amount of fuel that it uses is pretty amazing. It is, I will tell you in a second, 2.37 gallons of fuel for every mile, around 1,340 gallons of fuel per hour. And this is one single F-35 tank of gas produces the equivalent of 28 metric tons of carbon dioxide. So huge polluters, and this is just looking at one particular weapons system.
Another important point that you raise here, the Pentagon monopolizes funding that we need to tackle climate change. Like, can you talk about how massive military spending kind of consumes the funds and appropriates funds that could be used to develop alternative energy systems?
Well, sure. I mean, now we see that the budget for militarism in the 2024 budget is approaching $1 trillion. This is money that goes to the Pentagon, and on top of that, we have to add the billions of dollars we're spending on the war in Ukraine, and on top of that, we have to add the money that we're using in the Department of Energy that goes to the, quote, modernization of nuclear weapons. And you put this all together and you've got close to $1 trillion. Think of just, what this money could be going for. There are so many discussions right now about the debt ceiling in the United States, and the Republicans that are trying to take the money away from nutritional programs for the poor, take the money out of healthcare systems, out of affordable housing. And here you have this the massive pot of money that takes over 50% of our discretionary funds going to the Pentagon. And yet you hear no talk about, well, wouldn't this be the time to cut the Pentagon budget? And of course, when there's a question of war, whether it was the trillions of dollars we've spent on the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now so far $114 billion in Ukraine, there's never any discussion about where is this money coming from? How are we going to balance the budget? But when it's a question of money for even things like addressing the existential threat of the climate, which should be our number one national security threat, there is a huge fight in Congress and cutting away at the budgets for things that we need for a Green New Deal.
What do you mean when you say that climate change is a threat multiplier?
Well, we mean that there's already very dangerous situations in warring parties that come from histories of animosity or invasions by outside countries. But when you add to that the issues like lack of a water supply, drought, precarity in the ability to grow enough food, that these conditions that are a consequence of climate change also become issues that lead to or exacerbate the tendencies towards war. So you see more and more wars that have beneath the surface an issue about who is going to get access to water supplies, who is going to get access to the best agricultural land, who is going to get access to the seaports. All of these issues become more and more exacerbated with more, as we see more destruction of the climate.
And I recall sometime late last year, there was a conference, I believe it was here in the Netherlands, a military conference, a conference of high-tech military contractors who were talking about and brainstorming ways to develop new weapon systems and military strategies and tactics oriented towards confronting precisely these refugee flows coming from, Southwestern Asia, coming from the Middle East, coming from North Africa, and seeing these flows of refugees almost as an opportunity for new weapon systems to be developed.
Well, that is horrific. And instead of seeing how can we use new technologies to ensure that people have better lives where they're living, how to get at the root of the migration crisis to help people be able to deal with the climate crisis, we have never complied with our obligations to put $100 billion a year into a climate fund that would help poor countries mitigate the climate crisis that we in the wealthier countries have caused, and yet want to put money into technologies that would be able to keep people from seeking shelter.
You write, by choosing to prioritize our military over diplomacy, the U.S. sends the message that might makes right and makes it harder to find solutions to the climate crisis and military conflicts. Do you feel, Medea, Benjamin, that if the U.S. and NATO, but principally the United States, were to shift away from militarism and defund the Pentagon, reduce its funding towards the Pentagon, and redirect funds to addressing the environmental crisis we face, the climate crisis, that it would be easier to find solutions to the climate crisis if military funds were to be diverted away from militarism?
Absolutely. I mean, that's such an important thing to look at, David, or what are the ways that we could turn this around. I travel a lot on a book tour that I've been on speaking about Ukraine. And many times I also wrote a book about drone warfare and went to a lot of universities where there were engineering students. And they would come up to me afterwards and say, we would love to work on the climate. We want to work on how can we become leaders in clean, green energy? How can we become leaders in the kind of housing that we need that will be for the great examples of how you can build affordable housing that is energy efficient. We want to use our knowledge for all of these things. And they say, we can't find jobs because the jobs that are being offered to us all have something to do with the Pentagon. The Pentagon is where the big money is. And so it's not just the money that could be used, it's also the minds of these young people that really want to do good in the world, that want to turn this system around, and don't find the opportunities for doing that.
And then there's the mass media, the mainstream media in the United States, that constantly projects this idea that the greatest threat to the world today is China or Iran. But let's specifically China. China poses a huge threat to the world, and this is constantly being promulgated by the U.S. government and conveyed by the media, rather than the climate crisis.
Well, that's right, and we really need to work with China to deal with the climate crisis, because U.S. and China are the world's largest polluters. And yet China, on the other hand, is the world's largest producer of solar power, for example. And we really need to work with China. We need to collaborate. And when we put China out there as the enemy, this only justifies this massive and growing Pentagon budget. It only justifies this militaristic outlook on the world, and it turns us away from the climate crisis. We have a campaign, David, called China is Not Our Enemy, and we think it's so important that we try to counter the propaganda that puts China out there as this adversary that is trying to invade us and will try to overtake us, as they're doing around the world. And it not only justifies the massive Pentagon budget, but it also justifies this modernization of nuclear weapons. And when you talk about the climate, it's end all for the climate if we do have a nuclear war, which is one more reason why people have to see militarization as this enormous threat to the climate.
Medea Benjamin is a co-founder of the American feminist anti-war group Code Pink. Listen to and watch our complete conversation and link to Code Pink's climate crisis and militarism campaign at greenplanetmonitor.net. You are listening to the Green Planet Monitor. If you're appreciating what you're hearing, go to greenplanetmonitor.net and subscribe or donate, or both. With your generous help, we'll keep delivering Earth stories to listen to, read, and watch. In the early 20th century, Russian botanist Nikolai Vavilov identified Ethiopia as a cradle of crop diversity. Several strains of wheat, barley, sorghum, millet, flax, and coffee were born there. Ethiopia is also one of the world's great centers of plant diversification, spawning scores of unique varieties renowned for their resistance to disease and drought. Women farmers have played a leading role in selecting these hardy strains. Ironically, given its marginal reputation among nations, Ethiopia's seed wealth has become indispensable to the world. For the past few decades, a fungal crop disease has been spreading around the planet, threatening global human security like COVID never did. Just the thought of national wheat crops being wiped out in developed and developing countries alike has agronomists running to places like Ethiopia in search of disease and climate change-resistant varieties. This is where the central Ethiopian town of Ejere fits in. Ejere farmers are storing their best-performing seeds in a bank of their own. Here's a story about that.
Okay, very good.
This seed bank in Little Ejere, a dusty town in central Ethiopia, makes Birtukan Kabede laugh with pride.
Our seed bank is very good. He is help the poor farmers.
Inside a sturdy building of metal and cement, seeds from dozens of varieties of legumes, pulses, and cereals like wheat and barley are stored in dark, tightly sealed polypropylene bottles. Birtukan is the seed bank's secretary.
I'm the farmer. It is very helping me.
Ejeri's seed bank operates much as any bank would. Farmers grow crops that produce seed. Some of that seed is stored here. Member farmers can withdraw seed if they need to, but when the next crop comes in, they must pay back with interest, redeposit more seed than they borrowed.
So this is a bank for us. We select out of this bank, this one.
Genene Gezu works with an Ethiopian NGO called Ethio Organic Seed Action. He shows me some prize seeds.
This is the most expensive wheat type in marketplace, purple seeded, and it is produced with a simple compost or very minimum urea or DAP fertilizer. So for so many reasons, farmers like to plant these varieties. These are traditional farmers' varieties.
They don't need fertilizer and pesticides, and they come from around here. They also seem to be more resistant to disease, drought, and the effects of climate change. A half-hour's drive from Ejere, Genene takes me to where they're trying to prove this, in a set of fields 500 meters above Ethiopia's parched Rift Valley. Where are we?
Well, we are here now, the Farmer Field School. And the name of the place is Gonde.
Here in the village of Gonde, several hundred subsistence farmers are putting their homegrown seeds to the test.
Here is a selected farmers, a committee, and that guy is a development agent.
Hello. Welcome.
Gonde farmers are growing their own traditional semi-wild varieties. Scientists call them land races, side by side with so-called improved commercial varieties obtained from Ethiopian national labs. Walking down paths between the plots, it's hard to tell the difference, but these farmers know. Genene explains how farmers select wheat varieties with useful traits, deep green leaves, for example.
A bigger and wider leaf area and deep green has a direct correlation with higher yield. So they are selecting for those color issues.
Over the past couple of decades, Rift Valley farmers have exchanged their own traditional varieties of wheat for one or two so-called improved varieties that yield more grain. But uniform fields of a single wheat variety are more vulnerable to drought caused by climate change, and they've fallen prey to a scary new fungus now sweeping the planet, a wheat rust called UG99.
With the current issue of this climate change, it is not only the yield issues they are looking for. They are looking for adaptability.
These Ethiopian farmers are also returning to crop diversity.
They come to diversify, to plant legume crops like faba bean, rapeseed from oil crops, maize, sorghum, field pea, their own varieties, and also different stakeholders like research centers bring them different alternative crops that can break the monoculture of bread wheat, the disease cycle of rust, this fungus.
I like that one because it's full whole grain, you know.
In a quiet neighborhood of Ethiopia's capital city, Addis Ababa, I go visit the plant geneticist who turned farmer-run seed banks and science from dream to reality.
This is barley and peas, whole grain, roasted.
We munch on grains, sitting on a coffee table in front of us.
It's very traditional in Ethiopia.
Melaku Warede was the ideal person to champion the idea of Ethiopian farmers developing and managing their own traditional seeds. Fresh from a U.S. doctorate, Warede took charge of Ethiopia's Plant Genetic Resources Center in Addis Ababa. He set out to build a strategic reserve of seeds that could be handed to farmers in times of drought. It was a Canadian, Pat Mooney, who gave him the idea of getting farmers to develop and bank their own seed. A Canadian NGO, USC Canada, has been helping out ever since.
Put the farmer at the center.
The idea was heretical. Melaku recalls with glee how the scientific community responded.
I remember Birmingham University. I wish I had that article. They wrote by name, saying, this Dr. Warede, his idea is not, it's just it's not even scientific, saying we can grow in situ cultivated crops, so forth and so on.
Scientific experts argue that the most valuable seeds should be stored in modern gene banks in places like Europe and North America, under the watchful eye of real scientists and breeders. The notion of in situ seed conservation, the scientists said, was just plain crazy.
Until Professor Hawkes, a key person there, who used to visit us, said, "Can I look at your plots?"
The open-mindedness of a British researcher saved the day.
So this guy came, a well-established professor. He came and said, "Can I see your field?" I took him. He looked at everything. We pulled out the plants, the landrace, and the root development was so rich. This plant can capture all the moisture there. Then I pulled out a so-called modern variety. I said, "Look, this one is limited to the number of roots it has."
So the landrace had
more developed roots.
Had more developed root
system, yeah.
Soon, Malacu was asked to write a paper for the same journal that had criticized him. In the paper, Malacu reasoned that farmers had experimented with their crops for generations. They knew their traditional seeds were very special. Take sorghum, for instance.
There is one type of sorghum here in Ethiopia known as Watat Bogunche, which means milk in my cheeks, if you translate it literally.
Milk in my cheeks. It turns out this sorghum species is rich in the amino acid lysine that's also found in milk.
Which shows farmers know the value, although they don't say it. It is high lysine stuff. That thing is found, to my best knowledge, only in Ethiopia, in Wallo.
Malacu and I are now driving back to Ejere. It's Sunday, and a big field day is planned. We drive through rolling countryside, bursting with crops of all kinds, many of them traditional land races. Malacu marvels at the sight.
We brought it back and restored diversity. This very thing is happening, makes me happy. Farmers are now able to restore their seeds and have full control of that, and are benefiting from it as they always did in the past, rather than losing it.
In Ejere, several dozen visitors gather for a tour of the Ejere Farmers Field School. Signposts point to special exhibits, a fertilizer trial, an in situ conservation block, adaptation and participatory variety selection of advanced bread wheat. As the visitors file through the fields, beneath a sky filled with gray and blue clouds, Genene answers them in Amharic, peppered with English.
At DNA level, በሞለኪውላር biology, እነኚህ በጣም አብጠርጥሮ ማየት ያስፈልጋል.
The questioning is lively. These are people from Ethiopia's seed industry. They've got a stake in high-quality durum wheat, which can be turned into pasta and sold to Italy. The visitors crowd into Ejere's little seed bank. As they learn about how land races are stored, an Ethiopian television journalist named Abdul Shakur Hussein explains to me what's on their mind: the new killer wheat fungus, UG99.
The improved one, or the improved seed, being it is by this moment is attacked by different fungal disease, the production of it become decline. The land race or the local seed can resist the disease one.
It can.
Yeah.
The expert visitors are clearly impressed by the genetic potential before them. Farmers and visitors gather inside a big tent to hear speeches shielded from the blazing sun. Speeches are given and awards handed out. A few steps away, a handful of women take turns tending a session of traditional coffee brewing. A woman sits in a traditional Ethiopian gown, on a red milk crate, surrounded by brightly colored plastic flowers and bowls of popcorn, roasting coffee beans on a small metal dish atop a little charcoal brazier.
So you're stirring coffee beans. You're roasting coffee beans.
Okay. It's very good.
It's Birtukan Kabede, the secretary of Jerry's seed bank. Birtukan can't help laughing.
Coffee is very good. Coffee is very good. Every day we are drinking.
And it's very good. It's
Yes.
the best coffee in the world.
It is the best coffee. The Ethiopia's coffee is best. Another country in the Africa, it is best.
While Birtukan and her friends brew a carafe of Ethiopia's very best, others gather around a big barrel of something called tala. It's traditional hooch, brewed from local wheat.
I'm going to get myself some more tala. Here he's pouring it from a blue jerry can into a much larger blue vat. I'm getting a cup of this poured for me. Oh, and it's kind of full. It's a fuller shade of full. It's got a certain burnt taste to it. It's good.
The very sweet. It's a local beer. Local beer.
Here's to Ethiopia.
Cheers. Which one? Oh,
Cheers.
Cheers.
A mug of tala isn't terribly potent, but after 7 or 8, farmers are liable to celebrate.
I'm very happy today because my said bank is a very good bank. Because of this, I'm very happy. I'm playing.
There's good reason to celebrate and toast Melaku's dream of community seed banks, keeping farmers independent of foreign aid and in full control over these seeds of survival that have taken generations to develop. For more information about Little Ejere's seed bank and a link to a longer version of this story, go to greenplanetmonitor.net. While you're there, subscribe for $5 or more. You'll be helping to make this news package happen. You are listening to the Green Planet Monitor. I'm David Kattenberg. Balata refugee camp sits on the eastern edge of the Palestinian city of Nablus, home to 30,000 Palestinians expelled from their homes during Israel's 1947-48 War of Conquest. Balata is routinely invaded by Israeli soldiers seeking to root out what they call terrorists. Earlier this month, 3 young men were gunned down in the course of a raid on the camp by 200 heavily armed soldiers. Several Palestinian dwellings were blown up and dozens were injured. According to Israeli media, a Palestinian ambulance was blocked from entering the area in flagrant breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention. In preparation for their raid, hours earlier, Israeli soldiers disguised as Palestinians commandeered homes in the vicinity of their target so that snipers could be placed on their rooftops. I learned about the incursion into Balata in an email to the Ottawa Citizen, forwarded to me by its author, a gentleman named Peter Larson. Quote, "The ongoing expansion of Israel's footprint in the West Bank," Larson wrote, "and its violent repression of Palestinian resistance to that expansion deserves to be brought to Canadian public attention. I'm sorry to say that the Citizen's silence on this matter makes it easier for Israel to continue to batter the Palestinians without any international repercussions." Unquote. Ha, I thought. I should speak to Peter about this. Larson is the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine and the author of a weekly newsletter called Canada Talks Israel-Palestine. Over the past decade, Larson has taught a course about the Middle East at Carleton University and has taken groups of Canadians on tours up and down occupied Palestine, guiding them through the complexities of Israel-Palestine's so-called conflict. Israel-Palestine is complex. People often say it's a really complex issue. Of course it is complex, but sometimes I kind of think it's really sort of simple. Can you share your thoughts on this?
Sure, and I sometimes get criticized for that, saying, "Oh, it isn't complex at all." If you allow me to make an analogy with the Truth and Reconciliation and the issues around Indigenous rights in Canada, I think it's very simple what happened. What's complex is what to do about it. Mm-hmm. In that sense, I think the Israel-Palestine issue, it's very clear that colonial powers conspired to allow European Jews to take over half of Palestine and then gradually expand their footprint. That's simple. What's complicated is what to do about it now, given the fact that there are 6 million Israeli Jews living there. Many of them are born there. I mean, some of them are second generation. It's not simple what to do.
Although many people would vociferously deny with what you've just said, it's really simple. Historic Palestine was taken over by European colonists. If you said that to the folks at this organization with the Orwellian name, I won't repeat it, that claims to be monitoring the Canadian media, they'd get all up in arms, as would most any other Zionist or Israel supporter. They'd say, no way, the Jewish people have 3,000-year connection. To call it a settler colonial state is completely, not only is it wrong, it's injurious.
Well, I doubt that I'll ever convince them otherwise, but if someone of good will asks the kind of question, I would respond basically by saying, it's true that Jews have lived in that area for at least 3,000 years, or there have been people living in that area who would describe themselves as Jews. There have been people living in that area for 2,000 years that describe themselves as Christians. People living in that area for at least 1,400 years describe themselves as Muslims. What was new about the creation of the State of Israel was not the Jewishness so much as they were Europeans. There was a European colonial project. The Jews who were living in Israel prior to that spoke Arabic. These new Jews that came from Europe came fleeing the Holocaust, but they spoke Yiddish or a variety of other different languages. So from the Palestinian point of view, this was not so much a Jewish invasion. This was a European invasion on the back of European guns and soldiers.
Peter, I was compelled to suggest that you and I speak. I mean, you and I have spoken in the past. You've interviewed me, and you're the guy typically who's asking the questions, not the other way around. I was compelled to suggest we sit down and do this because I read a copy of a letter that you wrote to the Ottawa Citizen just the other day regarding an Israeli military invasion of Balata refugee camp in Nablus. Can you tell me about what happened? Actually, somebody emailed you, a resident of that camp emailed you, which is interesting. A resident of Balata refugee camp emailed you and provided you with a first-hand account of what happened. What did this person tell you?
Sure. The context, David, is that last fall I took a 3-week trip to Israel, Palestine, and part of it entailed going to Nablus, and I stayed overnight in the Balata refugee camp, where they have a little center there. So I know some of the people involved. And Balata camp is sort of on the periphery of the city of Nablus, Nablus being one of the 3 or 4 major Palestinian cities in the West Bank, and a center of resistance to Israeli expanding its footprint in the West Bank. And there has arisen in Nablus and in Jenin and a couple other places some very determined young people who are basically saying, The notion about the two-state solution is ridiculous. It's not going anywhere. The Israelis continue to expand their footprint. The settlers continue to attack us, and we're going to take up armed resistance to it. Some of your readers may have heard of a group called the Lion's Den. When I was there, the most popular song on the radio was about, in the Palestinian radio, was about the Lion's Den. So that's the context. And the Israelis have conducted a number of, this is the second or third military raid into Nablus in the last week. And my friend wrote to me, I checked it out on the internet and saw that the Times of Israel had written about it, the BBC had written about it, Al Jazeera had written about this major raid where 4 people were killed, a number of houses were blown up, hundreds were injured, but the Ottawa Citizen didn't even have any reference to it at all.
200 Israeli soldiers went in heavily armored vehicles, which we've seen the photos, and they placed snipers on the roofs.
Yeah, so the routine seems to be fairly clear. I've had this described to me in other places as well. Israeli snipers go in undercover. They get dressed up as vegetable vendors or whatever. A lot of them are Arab-speaking. It can be Druze or Arab-speaking Israelis of one sort or another. They can insinuate themselves into the center of the town, and they've identified houses they want to take over as. First of all, they know what their target is, and then they identify what houses do we need to take control of in order to be able to circle that target. So then they penetrate into those houses, round up the people in them at gunpoint, and force them into the living room or the dining room or whatever. And they may have to stay there for 24 hours while the Israeli snipers set up from their houses, so that then when the actual attack comes, the snipers are able to shoot anybody who is throwing stones at the Israeli armored vehicles that come in and so on.
So these soldiers have actually commandeered the homes of people, 12 or 24 hours before the actual assault.
Correct. And nobody knows because their phones are seized, they're cut off, so they can't tell people we've been commandeered. And while these guys are setting up their basically firing spots, and then they are prepared to shoot anybody who comes into the street or who is trying to impede the invasion by the main force. In this case, they even came in with bulldozers. They bulldozed some houses, or I'm not sure what they bulldozed, but they bulldozed.
And the houses, the homes they commandeer, they also ransack. There have been reports of soldiers stealing things and ransacking the places.
I've read about that as well. That's right.
Tell me about the trips that you organize and the Ottawa Forum organizes to Palestine. Who goes on these trips? Where do you go? And what are people's thoughts when they register for these tours? And what are they thinking when they come back?
For about 5 years, I was giving a course in the Learning in Retirement program at Carleton University. It was called Israel Palestine, Will It Ever End? And that was a six 2-hour sessions. And by the way, I always made a point of giving over one of those 2-hour sessions to a rabbi, or in one case to the vice president of CJA, to come and explain his or her point of view. But at the end of that, a lot of people asked if they could come with me because I would tell them I'd take trips. So the people who came tended to be retired people who were interested in social justice issues generally. Some of them, I think, went because that's an area of the world they haven't been before. So it's maybe a bit more tourism kind of thing. But I would organize a trip that spent half its time in Israel and half the time in the West Bank, half the time talking to Jews, half the time talking to Palestinians. And at the end of it, I would say that overwhelmingly, people were shocked and disgusted and annoyed and wanted the Canadian government to do something. I don't think it's true to say, I wish it were true. I don't think they come back with the same political position that I do, but they certainly support what I'm doing. Many of them have joined my organization, the Ottawa Forum in Israel Palestine, or some of them are on my advisory committee. They wouldn't go so far as to say that Israel is a settler colonial project, and they probably would, many of them would still think that maybe the answer is a two-state solution. But where we agree is that they're very annoyed over what the Canadian government does or doesn't do in this issue, and they wish it would do more.
And it's pretty astonishing to visit Palestine, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, as I have on 7 or 8 occasions, to travel from, West Jerusalem bus station across the non-existent fully erased and fictitious Green Line into East Jerusalem and then into the Jordan Valley, past Ma'ale Adumim, to Highway 90, which goes up and down the Jordan Valley, and then all the way up. I've done this. I've crossed into the Jordan Valley from Jordan, across the King Hussein Bridge, and from there to Jericho, and from there to Jerusalem. And I've traveled up and down Highway 60 from Hebron to Jenin. And it's pretty hard. I'd say it's impossible to do that without realizing that, seeing that the occupied territories are really part of Israel. And to disbelieve this idea that it'll ever become a Palestinian state. And the reality of Israeli apartheid kind of hits you in the face. That's me talking. How about you?
Well, I don't disagree. I would just maybe fill it out a bit by adding the fact that my perspective also has been influenced over the time by visiting a number of refugee camps, both in the West Bank, in Jordan, in Gaza. And that sort of kind of experience talking to refugees has made it clear to me that a two-state solution is not possible. There might be a two-state deal. Possible if you gave enough money to the PA or to the Israelis, it'd be a two-state deal, but it wouldn't be a solution because it doesn't solve the problem of the refugees, and it doesn't at all address the issues of the Palestinians who are living now in a state that calls itself officially Jewish and gives more rights to Jews than to its Palestinian non-Jewish citizens. So in my view, even if a deal were signed, pretty quickly frustration would fester, kind of as it has subsequent to the Oslo Accords, and people will find that this was not really a solution at all.
Do you get criticized or even worse for the things you say and the people you speak with on your blog?
Sure, I do. I get criticized. I mean, I think anybody who speaks up for Palestinian rights runs the risk of being accused of being anti-Semitic. I don't like it, but I like it and I don't like it, because when I'm criticized publicly, I say, well, how am I anti-Semitic? Explain that to me. I mean, it tends to be an emotional reaction rather than a substantive one. And I'd say, bring it on. I don't want to be anti-Semitic. I don't think I'm anti-Semitic. And if you think I am, explain why you think that's the case. And usually that ends the conversation. I very rarely get people a couple of times I've actually said to people, would you like to do a blog post with me? I'd be happy to have a discussion with them. In my experience, David, is that Zionists often have a lot of emotion, but they're reluctant to have a public discussion about their issues. And I think partly it's because they are internally, especially liberal Zionists, are internally conflicted between their liberalism and their Zionism. And I was thrilled that 2 weeks ago, I was able to get a man named John Allen, for whom I have a lot of respect, a former Canadian ambassador to Israel, a Jew. And we had a long debate organized by the Canadian International Council on whether or not a two-state solution is still possible. And I admire John for the fact that he has the integrity to say, okay, I'll be glad to debate that with you. And we had a long debate, and it was cordial, and we came out disagreeing.
What should Canada's, the Canadian government's policy be vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine and pursuit of the two-state solution? Holding Israel accountable, reading these documents that purport or allege or document Israel's nature as an apartheid state. What should Canada's position or policy be? What should the major components of Israeli or evolving Canadian government policy be?
I think I just want to make a slight. I never used the word Israel and Palestine. Never used the phrase Israel and Palestine. I always say Israel-Palestine, and it's because Israel and Palestine, to me, implies that they're two different geographical locations. And in my view, Israel and Palestine. When I arrive at Ben Gurion Airport, the sign says "Welcome to Israel," but my Palestinian friends meet me at the airport and they say "Welcome to Palestine." So I purposely use the word Israel-Palestine just as a way of describing things. In terms of Canada's position, I think we would do much better to focus on the issue of human rights. Canada claims to be a big supporter of international human rights, and we're vocal in some areas. But in the area of Israel-Palestine, we have subordinated our support for human rights to this very elusive search for a two-state solution that I don't think really exists. I don't think we need to pronounce ourselves on a one-state solution or a two-state. I think we should say our important objective is human rights. And when Israelis destroy houses and Israelis build settlements, Israelis kill Palestinians, that should be denounced. And if the Palestinians were to destroy some Israeli houses, or if the Palestinians were to penetrate into Israel and build a wall, or if the Palestinians were, I think those things should be denounced as well. But I think we should focus on human rights and not subordinate that to this mythical peace process.
And Israel's settlement enterprise, now 55 years old, is flagrantly illegal. It's being declared as such by the UN Security Council and multiple UN agencies and judicial bodies. And it is the government of Canada's official position that the settlements are illegal. How should the Canadian government policy reflect its position that the settlements are illegal? What should Canada do to hold Israel accountable for the illegality of its settlements?
I think that those of us who are interested in Palestinian human rights need to be thoughtful about the various pressures that Canada is under. Canada is a long ways away. For most Canadians, this is not really an issue. They're much more interested in whether Donovan Bailey's going to buy the Ottawa Citizen, the Ottawa Senators or whatever, than they are. So it's not a top issue for most Canadians. And even if, frankly, David, you were Prime Minister, I were Prime Minister, and I made you Minister of Middle East Affairs, there's precious little you can do. Like, Canada doesn't have very many levers there. We don't have money to spend. There's some things we can do.
Well, you can ban settlement products from entering Canada.
Absolutely. We could not sign a free trade agreement with Israel, for example. So there are a number of things that's right, that we could do, but there isn't a lot. So that's where I think we should be reasonable and practical, but I think that we should support for UNRWA banning products from the West Bank, which according to Francesca Albanese are themselves war crimes. House demolitions, the building settlements themselves is against the UN Security Council resolution.
Violates the Fourth Geneva Convention.
And the right to return, and all these things are things that Canada could weigh in. And I think a practical way for Canada to do that is to join with like-minded countries. It's pretty dangerous for Canada to be an outlier on this. But I think there are a number of like-minded countries, Ireland and the Scandinavian countries and so on, with whom we could ally on this. And I think that's the safest way for Canada to move forward.
Peter Larson is the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. His weekly newsletter, Canada Talks Israel-Palestine, features interviews with informed guests and differing views on the origin of this so-called conflict. We'll post a link to Peter's newsletter and a few of his best interviews and our complete conversation at greenplanetmonitor.net. That's it for today's GPM, coming to you from Earth Chronicle Productions, Breda in the Netherlands. Listen, read, and watch more Earth stories at greenplanetmonitor.net. And please support independent Earth journalism. Subscribe to the GPM at greenplanetmonitor.net. By the way, the guy behind this guitar is Dan Weisenberger. Thanks for the wonderful theme music, Dan. I'm David Kattenberg. Over and out for now.